In the fall of 1964, just days before the Tokyo Olympic Games opened on television sets across the free world, a young woman in East Berlin stepped up to an ordinary courtyard gate, whispered a single word, and bet her life that the man she loved had found a way under the most dangerous border on Earth. Her name was Christa Gruhl, and the tunnel she slipped into that night, Tunnel 57, would become the most successful escape tunnel in the history of the Berlin Wall. This is not just a story about shovels and dirt. It is a Cold War love story, written in concrete, barbed wire, and engineering. On one side, a communist regime trusted its future to walls, guards, and secret police. On the other, a group of students in a free city used physics, courage, and a little bit of American-style ingenuity to turn the ground beneath that wall into a passage to the west. To understand how Christa ended up at that gate, you have to go back 3 years, to the moment when a young East German named Joachim Neumann decided that the line his government had drawn across his city did not apply to him. Neumann and Christa met in East Berlin when they were both about 22 years old. He was a civil engineering student, the sort of mind that looked at structures and thought in terms of stress, load, and hidden weaknesses. She was studying and working in the East, like millions of other young people trying to build a life under a system they had never voted for. Like so many couples in divided Berlin, they believed they had time, that the wall was an outrage, but maybe a temporary one. The regime had other ideas. The wall had gone up overnight in August 1961, barbed wire at first, then concrete, then ditches and tank traps, cutting off East Berliners from jobs, family, and dreams in the West. The government called it a defensive measure against fascists. In reality, it was a net thrown over its own people. In December 1961, a few months after the barrier went up, Joachim made his first big move. Armed not with a gun, but with a borrowed Swiss passport and a talent for bluffing, he walked into a border crossing point and presented himself as a foreign tourist. He refused to speak German, acting like an arrogant visitor who thought the whole process was an inconvenience beneath him. The border guards, unsure how to handle a stubborn Swiss passenger who wouldn't play the part of a grateful socialist citizen, eventually waved him through. In that moment, he crossed from East to West Berlin, not through a tunnel or over the wall, but through a hole in the regime's ability to read people. His escape was successful, but he left behind family, friends, and most of all, Christa Gruhl. On the western side, Joachim could have settled into a new life and tried to forget the girl he had left behind in the cage. Instead, he decided that if the wall was going to stand, he would go under it. He joined forces with groups of students and activists in West Berlin who were beginning to dig tunnels back into the East to rescue loved ones. For him, every tunnel had a name, Christa. In 1962, he became involved in a project that would later be known as Tunnel 29, a hand-dug passage that eventually allowed 29 people to escape and even attracted the attention of American television crews. Christa hoped to be among those who would crawl through, but the East German secret police, the Stasi, were already watching. They had infiltrated networks, placed informants in families, and turned neighbors into ears. Shortly before the night Christa was supposed to slip away through Tunnel 29, someone betrayed the plan. The Stasi moved in. They flooded the tunnel with water and arrested the would-be escapees who came to the rendezvous point, including Christa herself. One day she was imagining a walk into the West. The next, she was marched into custody for clarification of a matter, as the bland bureaucratic phrase put it, and vanished into the machinery of a police state. Interrogations followed, long sessions in bare rooms, under the gaze of men who already assumed her guilt. The charge was Republikflucht, flight from the Republic, compounded by involvement in organizing an underground escape route. In the East German system, that was not youthful mischief, it was political crime. According to later accounts, Christa spent months in pre-trial detention and then sentenced to around 16 months of imprisonment, serving from roughly April 1963 to September 1964. She was in her early 20s, locked in cells for the crime of wanting to live with her boyfriend on the other side of town. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, Joachim was doing something that would have made sense to an American civil engineer or combat engineer. He kept digging. He knew Christa was in prison. He did not know when she would be released, but he believed that sooner or later the Stasi would let her out, and when they did, he intended to have a door waiting under the wall. He joined up with other escape helpers in the wedding district and began work on a new tunnel from an abandoned signalman's hut. That project failed. The ground was too sandy, the risk of collapse too great. So he moved to another group, the one that had access to the basement of an empty bakery at 97 Bernauer Strasse, right along the border. From that basement, a team of about 35 West Berliners, many of them students of the Free University, including future astronaut Reinhard Führer, began to drive a new shaft deep under the border zone. This was the birth of what history would call Tunnel 57. They were not using heavy machinery. They had shovels, pickaxes, hand saws, wooden beams, and wheelbarrows, but they also had physics, surveying skills, and the freedom to apply those skills without asking permission from a party committee. On one side, a communist regime trusted its future to walls, guards, and secret police. On the other, a group of students in a free city used physics, courage, and a little bit of American-style ingenuity to turn the ground beneath that wall into a passage to the west.
It started in the bakery basement on the west side and emerged, undetected, in a disused outhouse in the rear yard of an apartment building at Strelitzer Strasse 55 in East Berlin. It was, as one guide later put it, the deepest and longest of all the wall tunnels, and certainly the most effective. While Joachim and his friends were underground, Christa was still above, counting days behind bars. One German article about their story describes how he spent his time in the tunnel mentally composing letters to her, replaying her words, and telling himself a simple motto: accept what you cannot change, change what you can. He could not unlock her cell. He could dig. In late September and early October 1964, the tunnel was finally ready. Couriers in East Berlin had passed word to around 120 carefully selected people. On the nights of October 3rd and 4th, come to the gate of Strelitzer Strasse 55, say the password, and someone would lead you to a small brick outbuilding in the courtyard, a former backyard toilet that now hid a hole into the west. On October 3rd, families arrived one by one. They were admitted by escape helpers like Reinhard Führer, checked, then guided to the outhouse. They descended into the tunnel and crawled, single file, through damp earth supported by timber toward the bakery. That night, 29 people reached freedom. Christa was not among them. As far as Joachim knew, she was still locked in an East German prison with months left on her sentence. Then, the next day, something happened that any storyteller would hesitate to invent because it sounds too perfect. A letter arrived in West Berlin addressed to Joachim. It was from Christa. She had been released early, weeks or months before her official date, and was back in East Berlin. She had no idea there was a tunnel beneath the wall. She just wanted him to know that she was out. Smithsonian's account calls it a miracle. The next day, Neumann received an unexpected letter from his girlfriend, Christa, who wasn't due to be released until December. She had been freed early and was writing to tell him, knowing nothing of the new underground project. In that moment, Joachim realized that the mission he had been preparing for years, digging for chunks of clay, sweating in the dark, risking arrest, had suddenly become urgent in a way it had never been before. Christa was free, but still on the wrong side of the wall. He had a working tunnel. He did not know how long it would remain undiscovered. He had to get word to her. No one outside of intelligence files knows exactly how the message traveled. Phones were monitored, mail could be opened, friends could be informants. But somewhere in East Berlin, a trusted intermediate, one of those anonymous couriers of the Cold War, carried a simple instruction. Come tonight to Strelitzer Strasse 55. Speak the password at the gate. He'll be waiting. That night, Christa walked through the streets of East Berlin, a city she knew all too well from the vantage point of a cell window and a prison yard. She was, legally, a free citizen again. In reality, she was still surrounded by concrete, barbed wire, and people trained to see enemies in every shadow. She reached the gate of Strelitzer Strasse 55 and pressed the bell or knocked. From inside, a voice asked for the word. She whispered the agreed-upon code. The gate opened. In the courtyard, past the windows where ordinary life still flickered, curtains drawn, radios low, stood Joachim. They had not seen each other since he had crossed into the West almost 3 years earlier. She had survived interrogation and 16 months of incarceration. He had survived the mental strain of digging one failed tunnel after another, not knowing if she was even alive. According to one detailed retelling, they embraced only briefly. There was no time for speeches or long goodbyes to the life she was leaving. He was on guard duty at the tunnel entrance, watching for trouble. He pointed her toward the small, shabby brick outhouse at the edge of the yard. The door creaked open. Christa climbed down into the darkness. The tunnel was low and close, the air heavy, the wooden beams pressing in from the sides. She crawled, hands, knees, feeling the decades-old soil of Berlin cling to her palms. Above her, the wall and its guards still stood, completely unaware that one of their former prisoners was passing beneath them. On the western side, hands reached down to pull her up into the bakery basement. For Christa, that moment was the inversion of her first arrest. Instead of being dragged down into a cell by men in uniform, she was being lifted into freedom by fellow students in work-stained clothes. Instead of a door clanging shut behind her, there was the muffled thud of a trapdoor closing over a passage that was still, for a few precious hours, secret. This time, the tunnel worked. Christa, who had been caught and condemned on her first attempt to flee under the wall, made it across on the second. While she was taking her first deep breaths of West Berlin air, the operation continued in the courtyard. More fugitives arrived, more passwords were exchanged, more people slid into the labyrinth of earth that connected their old lives to new ones. On the second night, however, the informant in their network made his move. 2 Stasi officers in plain clothes showed up at the gate, claiming they too wanted to flee and needed to fetch a friend. They had just confirmed the existence and location of the tunnel entrance. Soon, border troops and more Stasi surrounded the building. In the courtyard, as escape helpers like Christian Zobel realized they'd been compromised, a confrontation broke out. Shots were fired. A young German border guard named Egon Schultz was first hit by a round from Zobel's own pistol and then fatally from his own side's Kalashnikovs. The regime turned him into a martyr, blaming West Berlin terrorists and hiding for decades the fact that the killing shot had been friendly fire. In the chaos, the last fugitives scrambled through the outhouse hatch and into the tunnel. Escape helpers on the eastern side dove in after them, racing for the safety of the bakery basement, while East German forces locked down the courtyard. By the time it was over, 57 people had made it out through Tunnel 57 in those 2 nights. Christa was one of them. For the East German readership, stories like this were a nightmare. They had invested enormous resources in physical defenses: walls, fences, mines, guard towers, patrol roads, and command bunkers. They had surveillance systems, informant networks, and the full power of a security state. And yet, a handful of university students with some shovels, buckets, and the technical skills of a civil engineer had broken their border from below. In the numbers game of the Cold War, those 57 escapees represented nearly 1/5 of all the successful tunnel escapes over the wall's entire 28-year history. In the West, the reaction was very different. The press celebrated the ingenuity and bravery of the diggers. Articles and documentaries framed Tunnel 57 as a symbol of what free people could accomplish when they combined technical know-how with moral conviction. While the Soviet bloc leaned on walls and secrecy, the free world leaned on openness and innovation. For an American audience watching from across the Atlantic, the pattern was familiar. In World War II, Americans had watched German armor and rocketry with a kind of horrified respect, then watched Allied industry and engineering outproduce and outmaneuver them. In the Cold War, they watched as their own country poured money into research labs, aerospace programs, and advanced industry, pushing the technological frontier so fast that Soviet planners struggled to keep up. The Berlin Wall was the physical embodiment of the communist attempt to stop that tide, to freeze people in place and keep Western ideas and images from seeping eastward. Tunnels like 57, dug with precision and patience, turned the wall into a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be accepted. After Tunnel 57, Christa's story did not end in the headlines. She and Joachim married in May 1965, building a life in West Germany. He became a successful civil engineer, specializing in underground construction, helping design and plan around 60 tunnels for legitimate projects over the course of his career. The man who had once risked prison to dig illegal escape routes now used his skills to shape a reunified country's infrastructure. Christa studied and later worked as a chemical engineer, living the kind of open, self-directed life that had been impossible in the East. Together, they adopted a son and a daughter in the 1970s, raising a family in a world where borders were lines on maps, not walls lined with guns. Decades later, when journalists interviewed them for articles with titles like Deep Love, they spoke about their past with a mix of humor and gravity. Christa, who would eventually face a battle with cancer, said she tried to approach illness the same way she had approached prison. Getting lost in despair, hitting walls with your fists, does nothing. You change what you can change. You accept what you cannot. So for Americans listening to their story today, the emotional resonance lies in that contrast. On one side of the Iron Curtain, a government tried to control reality with concrete and fear, backed by Soviet tanks and a network of informers. On the other, a young engineer and his friends applied the same mindset that built bridges and skyscrapers and, across the ocean, jet bombers and spacecraft to one goal: get people out. The same West that engineered the Berlin airlift, the Apollo missions, and the space shuttle also produced the climate in which a handful of students could quietly organize, raise funds, coordinate with foreign media, and spend months on an illegal construction project beneath the nose of a hostile state. They were not acting alone. They were acting from within a system that, despite all its flaws, trusted citizens more than it feared them. Christa Gruhl's journey from betrayed fugitive to prisoner to successful escapee and, finally, to citizen of a reunified Germany captures the human dimension of that technological and moral contest. It shows how, in the shadow of missile silos and spy planes, some of the most consequential battles of the Cold War were fought with improvised tools and quiet resolve. And it reminds anyone watching from an American couch that in a world of walls, the side that keeps producing people who are willing to dig and people who are willing to help them tends, sooner or later, to win.